Hi, everybody. We're here for yet another healthcare and language access series. Really excited today to speak with Dele Atanda, who I had the pleasure of meeting at the recent health conference. Dele was there actually showcasing some of what he is working on. I want to take this opportunity to introduce you to this amazing person, his background, and why he's doing what he's doing. Really exciting for the very moment that we're living right now in the midst of a global pandemic. What I'll say about the health conference where we got the chance to meet is that there was a ton of innovation around how to handle the COVID-19 pandemic. So I don't want to spoil too much. I'd love to introduce Dele at this point. Hello, sir. Can you please give us a little background? Tell us who you are. Tell us where you are. Anything you'd like to do to introduce yourself to start.
Excellent. Thanks so much for having me, Jeff. Yeah, no, Health was a great conference, and we were actually at it last year. And interestingly enough, last year we were there with IBM presenting a mental health app that we had been working on with IBM, or with IBM as a client. It was really around about digital health and digital therapeutics and digital interventions, precision medicine. Our panel was last year, and it was really about we had been working on an app that enabled employees to have their emails and social media posts analyzed by an AI to assess their levels of stress.
Sorry, one quick question, just to make sure we're establishing the identity correctly. Your company, MetaMe, right?
The company's MetaMe, and although there's two elements to our organization, so there's a company MetaMe, and then we have an NGO, a nonprofit called the Internet Foundation. And just to give you the context about that, I've been working in digital for too long, a couple of decades at least, anyway, and working with large multinational corporations, mostly heading up digital innovation and digital transformation and building large enterprise scale digital platforms. And in that, I became quite interested in data and data as a means of being able to enable better engagement and facilitate better experiences. But as I looked at data more and more, I started to see that there were bigger social issues at play, like around ownership, sovereignty, privacy. And as I looked at this more, I started to see that these were significant social issues, these were significant civil rights issues, and ultimately becoming significant human rights issues. And when I first started looking at this, it was really around 2008, 2009, when things like the Arab Spring. So we started to see that the internet could be a big force in driving social change. But what we also started to see at that point was that people's lives were potentially at danger from their digital footprints, effectively.
Wow. I'd love for you to tell me why the Arab Spring in particular is a point that inspired you.
I've always been a bit of a technologist. I've been in the digital space since 99 or so, working professionally as a producer. I first worked with the Central Office of Information in the UK. So I was very interested in digital transformation. And actually, in 2009, I started working on a book called The Digitarian Tsunami. And it was like Web 3.0 and the rise of the neo citizen. So for me, it was clear that digitalization was driving a massive social transformation. And, at this point where the internet, Web 2 was born effectively, Web 1 had come and gone. And, the internet was becoming this big driver of economic prosperity. So I was very much interested in the future of the internet. And I think I started writing this book because people often said that, it's impossible to predict where the web is going. It's impossible to know what was going on. And I took the view that, well, actually, no, there are some macro trends here that you can see that are driving the transformation of the internet. And so I was looking at it from this macro social perspective. And the Arab Springs was really one of the biggest sort of wake up call to the power of the internet as a force for social change. In that regards. And, the Arab Spring is where we first saw social media playing an active role in driving social change.
I do remember that when it happened and how quickly the information got around as being a defining moment as well. That's very interesting. In the course of you writing the book is when that happened, and kind of really highlighted it for you. So I'm understanding so far that your focus on data and the understanding of it was clear at that point. Now, that event was inspiring for you in understanding social transformation and how digitization plays a role.
I think the thing that really came home to me at that point was the dangers, in terms of surveillance and people's digital footprints, and how people's lives could be at danger from their digital footprint, particularly if they were activists and standing up for, against governments or against policies or against status quo trends or whatever. The fact that people could have their lives in danger from the activities that they were doing online was a first in that sense then. And that really highlighted to me why we needed to have cyber human rights in that regards, that we needed to be able to protect the right to free speech, the right to free assembly, the right to privacy, the right to property, all of these things that we take for granted in the physical world. It became clear to me that we needed to understand how these things played out in the digital world. And because the world was moving towards digitization, which is what I was fascinated about anyway, and that as it was moving towards digitization, we needed to actually understand the threats as well as the opportunities that came from that process.
Now, there's so much to tie together here, but tell us about of where the focus on data and healthcare plays in and when that became your focus.
Sure, and I want to get to that, but I just want to bring you to how we got to health specifically. So Arab Spring, importance of data. The next big milestone was the Snowden Gate revelations, because what that showed us was that this wasn't just happening in pockets, sort of fringe parts of the world, but happening on a global basis. In the Arab Spring, we were working towards secure messaging app, like using the Tor network and super encryption and all of this sort of stuff. Super secure messaging services, what we were building around that time. But then when Snowden's revelations happened, we realized that, this wasn't just happening in Syria or Afghanistan or these really, far off places, but it was in London, it was in New York, it was in Berlin, it was in Paris. The issue of surveillance, digital surveillance, became this global kind of challenge. So we set up the Internet Foundation as an NGO to campaign for universal digital rights as an extension of human rights as our first primary mandate, our North Star. And then we said that a second mandate was we created what we call a clean data charter, which is a framework for how companies should use data in a responsible and sustainable manner. And we saw data at that point kind of like where energy was 30 years before. And so our actual phrase was that if, everyone was running around saying data is the new oil. So like, well, if data is the new oil, we need a clean data ecosystem analogous to clean energy. And that's what we were trying to introduce. So we did a lot of work to create standards around how companies should use data responsibly. And long story short, that culminated this year with us establishing a clean, an ethical data standard with the British Standard Institute, which was published in February of this year. So that gives us a line in the sand now that we can actually use to audit companies and actually demonstrate what good data, clean data governance and usage looks like. So we had standards and policy pretty well developed at that stage. And then the next stage was really around the technology. Look, I won't bore you with the details of the technology, but what we developed was a really innovative way of managing information by basically creating tiny little nano information containers that we could audit and track using like blockchain technologies. Because basically, when we looked at the advocacy and policy and standards part, the problem that we always encountered was how do you enforce these rules about good data governance and good data usage? And how do you track compliance? And that was a hard problem to solve. But essentially, decentralized technologies, blockchain technologies came around and gave us the ability to do that. So we built a framework and a protocol for enabling data to be shared in a way that data owners could have complete control and sovereignty around how that data would be used and who would access it. So we initially had 3 sectors we were looking at: health, mobility, and media.
Sorry to interrupt. When you say that you are still talking about the Internet Foundation, right?
So at this point, it was MetaMe. So the way that we structure it is that the Internet Foundation sets up the network, the underpinning technology and the network, which is open source and anyone can use it. And then MetaMe is our for-profit company that builds off of these standards, off of the network, but in a proprietary manner. So we like to think of ourselves as the third operating system. MetaMe is this sort of operating system toolbox platform that allows us to have control and sovereignty around our data and create new data asset types that we can own and that we can exchange in ways that we control. And it serves as a platform for use case specific applications or industry specific applications. So we started looking at health and looking at mental health. And that was the story I was saying before. Last year with IBM, where we were on stage with IBM last year at Health, where we were introducing a mental health app that was really around giving people a way to have their social media posts and their email posts analyzed by an AI to assess whether they had high or low levels of stress. And if they had high levels of stress, then we could recommend stress management interventions or services that could help them manage their stress as a way of diagnosing and managing early mental health issues effectively. So that's sort of how we came into the health space generally. We realized that we needed to focus in on one vertical to kind of really get traction and move. And we decided to focus on health for three reasons. One, we've always been about impact, and we always wanted to have as much impact as possible in terms of data sovereignty. And I think when it comes to giving people ownership and control of their data, on one hand, what's the payoff, right? There's potentially a financial payoff, and that's kind of one of the propositions. How do you enable people to make money from their data? And that's important and becoming table stakes. But the other thing was, well, if you can actually improve the quality of people's lives and the length of people's lives, which is what health and medical sector really is focused on, then that struck us as a much more complete and compelling value proposition. If I can not only help you make money from your data, but actually make you healthier from your data and make you live longer from your data, then that's a very compelling set of value propositions on one hand. So that was the first thing. The second thing was that, without getting too lost in the detail of it, but while I was at IBM, I used to do a lot of work around AI and about setting up AI systems, like between cars, for example. How do you get different cars to talk to each other from different manufacturers? So what you realize very quickly is that there are three things that you really need for an AI system to work well. You need good AI itself, like, machine learning, deep mind algorithms. You need good data that the systems can use to train. But the missing piece is you need good ontologies, which is the relationship between the intelligence and the data is the ontology, what sits between them, effectively, that enables the intelligence to process the data efficiently. So the problem now starts to become when you bring ontologies from different industries together, because they don't work. They weren't designed like, aviation ontology doesn't talk to automotive ontology. And as you get to things like smart cars or autonomous cars, you need the ontology for the car, the city, the home, and the work environment to work together. Because as a user, I'm getting in the car from my home, I'm getting in the car to drive me across a smart city and to take me to my place of work. So you need the car to be able to connect with all of those spaces via those different ontologies. And what I realized from a data perspective, we've always looked at creating a comprehensive framework for managing data. I call it like a periodic table for data. Mm-hmm. That's sort of like one of our ambitions and goals within the Internet Foundation and MetaMe, so that you can have this real kind of new data economy emerge. But you need a common ontology for this data to work. And that's a big challenge for the tech industry. There's no, how do you design a single ontology that can work across all different contexts? Well, the answer is that you have to make it human-centric. And there is nothing more human-centric than health. Some of the most advanced ontologies that we have is around genetics and DNA in that sense. So if you develop an ontology around health, you develop an ontology that's effectively human-centric, and then you can build that as a basis for ontologies that can touch everything else effectively.
And when did you realize that building the ontology around health would, therefore making it human-centric, would be so valuable?
I think actually it first dawned on me while I was trying to solve these problems in the automotive industry that, I realized that we needed a common ontology here. That's when the problem really manifested itself to me. And so from that time, really, and I'd been doing a lot of work around, intelligent ecosystems, around how do you create, even just from a marketing perspective, how do you create systems where you can understand context, because we've always looked at data and always looked at transactions around data. And for us, you had some, we narrowed it down to a point that you could say that you have the content, the specific type of content in a transaction, like what information am I transacting? If it's like my medical history, my preconditions and medication that I'm on, and the like. So that is a type of content. And then who owns that information? Do I own it? Does Jeff own it? If that does my mother own it? Does a refugee own that information? Right. So that gives you interesting context itself by who owns the data. What is the data? Who owns it? And then who is transacting that data? Who wants access to that data? Is it like a healthcare company, like a service provider? Is it an insurance company? Is it a grocer? The context, the entity that's buying that data changes the risk associated with that data considerably, right? If it's someone who is giving me, if it's like a gym, a lifestyle product, for example, that wants to know my preconditions and any medication I'm on, the risk of me sharing it with that is relatively low. If it's a life insurance company, well, then the risk changes dramatically, right? So the person that's asking for the data is important. And then the last piece is, what is the intent? What do they want to do with that data? So those four things give you the context of a transaction. And all of those four things are variables. And if you change those variables, then the risk associated with that data set changes. So this is where we were thinking already. So this was the landscape, right? And then an ontology that would enable that to happen in a universal context really became the next level up from there.